Hello, everybody. One of the big things we've been talking about today is this question of what does technology do to us as individuals in society? And I want to make the argument that we actually have a great deal of choice over our technologies. We tend to assume that technologies have to turn out one way or another, and that's simply not true. We can choose what our technologies do for us. And to tell you this story, I want to talk a little bit about the fastest moving technology in human history. And this is not artificial intelligence. This is not social networks. This is not the internet. It's a much older technology. It's radio. You can't imagine how quickly radio went from being physically possible to being the dominant cultural force in the world. Before 1912, there was no such thing as broadcasting. It just wasn't possible. And teams in different parts of the world all invented the ability to transmit music and sound and the human voice. And within 10 years, this was the dominant medium through which people were getting information. If you think about how crazy this is, it took the internet 30 years from the first computer connected to the internet in 1969 until we had major commercial services online. Radio happens 3 times faster. And not only does radio happen very quickly, but it happens 3 uniquely different ways. 10 years into the development of radio, it's developed different ways in different countries. In my country, in the United States, it's free market chaos. Anyone can start up a radio station, and everybody does. There are 700 radio stations across the United States within the first 10 years. The Soviet Union, unsurprisingly, does it very differently. You can see the Soviet radio. It has only one knob on it, and that's just for volume. And that's because there are no stations to choose from. There is one station, comrade. You can have it on or off, and that's the choice that you have. And then there's the BBC. The British do something entirely different. They have a national broadcaster, but it's a broadcaster that has a mission to serve the people who are listening to it. It's in the spirit of public service. It's trying to figure out how this new technology can make society stronger and make it better. And that's the idea that I want to invite us all to think about today, because we need public service to come into digital media. So we are now 10 or 15 years into the social media revolution. And we're starting to see a set of models emerge. We have an international model where we have platforms that are largely based in the United States, largely based in California, but used everywhere. Everybody uses YouTube. And therefore, as Zainab was talking about earlier today, if YouTube is radicalizing us, if it's pushing us towards extreme content, it's a problem for all of us. We have the national model, and Korea is really interesting for this. Korea has its own unique social networks. They're not used outside the country. They have distinctly Korean characteristics. In the case of Chinese social media networks, those characteristics include very heavy censorship. That can be a really big problem for the national model. In some ways, it's why the international model has such strength. But there's a model that we don't talk about very often, which is the public service model. It's projects like Wikipedia, where we can all contribute and we jointly build a resource together. And just like the British chose a different model for radio, it's possible to choose these different models for the internet. We don't necessarily have to have Mark Zuckerberg as a billionaire. We can also have the model of Wikipedia as well. So the first point I want to make is this idea that just because we have a new technology, it doesn't inevitably equal a certain outcome. Just because we invent radio in 1912 doesn't mean that we necessarily get BTS. There's all sorts of cultural and local factors, including our choice for what we want media to do, that determines what we end up with. So this is a great moment to ask the question, do we like how social media is working? And as you heard from a number of the speakers earlier today, we're very worried that social media might be bad for us as citizens. We're worried that it might be bad for us as individuals. People are asking the question, is social media addictive? Are we spending too much time with our phones? Is social media making it impossible for us to hear viewpoints that we don't agree with and that we don't want to hear? And you're even seeing some thinkers come out there and say, it's just time to put down your phone. Walk away from social media. It's bad for us. Delete it. Step away. Move back into the real world. And I want to suggest that I think these thinkers are wrong, and I think that they're not nearly ambitious enough. The wrong question is to ask whether social media is bad for democracy. The right question is to ask, how would we build social media that was good for democracy? So I started thinking about this question a couple of years ago, and I put some ideas down of what I would want social networks to do. I would hope that social networks did some of what they already do. A lot of us get our news over social networks. A lot of us find solidarity and common ground with our friends over social networks. My friend Zainab, who talked to us before, studies how social networks help us mobilize, how they're helping people in Hong Kong go out in the streets and ask for freedom. But there's things that social media doesn't usually do very well, but it could. We could decide to build social media that optimized for diversity, that introduced us to people that we don't normally hear from. We could build social media that was a good, healthy space for discussion, where we're not just trying to go to the most extreme views, where we're not just trying to shout over each other. We could even, I believe, build social media that tries to help us learn how to be good citizens and how to build our way through difficult conflicts. So here's the social media that I'm trying to build. I'm trying to build public service digital media. Digital media that is not in the service of profits, not in the service of making money, but in the service of us as citizens and in the service of democracy. And I think that we need to have social media that does three things. It's plural in purpose, it's public in spirit, and it's participatory in its governance. So this notion of plural in purpose means that it cannot be one size fits all. We can't just have Facebook. We can't just have Kakao Talk. We need different social networks for different purposes. So here's an example that I like. My friend Ezra Al-Shafei in Bahrain has built a social network called Majal. And this is a social network for gay and lesbian Arab youth. And as you can imagine, if you're an out gay or lesbian teenager, you have particular needs. And one of those needs is secrecy. So on this network, you are banned from using your photograph. You have to use an avatar. And actually, there's very careful security. You can't start a new thread and start telling people that gays and lesbians are bad until you've been a member of the community for some weeks or months. And that's a way that they try to create a safe space for these conversations. Maybe it's not the rules you'd want for every space, but that's the whole point. You want to have different rules for different spaces. We want to build spaces that are public-spirited. They're not just for private communities, they're for helping us become better citizens and better members of democracy. And there, I'm inspired by my friend Wael Ghonim. Wael was one of the leaders of the Arab Spring in Egypt. He actually started the Facebook group that brought all the people out onto Tahrir Square. But he had a really interesting problem. He discovered that the tools that were so good for mobilizing people were really, really bad at letting people have civilized and polite conversations about the future of Egypt. So he started building a completely new network called Parlio, where all the rules are about forcing you to interact politely and kindly with people who you disagree with. It's very heavily moderated. And it's not for everyone. It's really for political leaders. It's for the next generation of people who are trying to figure out how to lead our societies forward. Finally, I think we need to build social media that invites us to be the moderators. It asks us to decide what rules we want to live through and how to enforce them. And for me, one of the best models there is Reddit, which is an amazingly popular site around the world. It's the 6th largest site in the United States, and it's completely run by tens of thousands of volunteer moderators who decide what the rules are. And some of these moderators are incredibly sophisticated. There's a community of more than 1,000 moderators who keep our science going to make sure that it really focuses on peer-reviewed scientific research. But I also think we need to build new tools. And one of those new tools that I've been building in my lab at MIT is called GOBO. You can try it out at gobo.social. It's a tool for navigating a world in which we have tons of different social networks. It's an aggregator for social networks. It puts them all together in the same place, and it gives you a degree of control that you don't currently have. If you're using Facebook, Facebook tells you what post you should look at next. In GOBO, you have controls. You can decide, I want to hear from more women. And you can change the slider, and it will shut up some of the men in your feed, which is not a bad idea. If you're having too much from one political point of view, you can flip a switch, and it will add more information into your feed. You can have information that is more viral, that's more popular. Or maybe you're having a bad day, and you just want to see what's funny. Whether or not this is the future of how we use social networks, having more control over those social networks is the future. We shouldn't accept a world in which these big platform companies have full control over what we see, particularly because, as Zeynep says, they're not optimizing for us as citizens in a democracy. They're optimizing to take as much of our attention as possible. So the question that I want to leave you with is this: what is it that we would want to build? We don't ask ourselves this question enough. We worry a lot about whether these platforms are good for us, whether they're bad for us, whether we should stop using them, whether we should stop our children from using them. I want you to stop asking that question. I want you to ask a very different question. What would we want to build if we wanted social media that was good for us in a democracy? Let's start there. Let's imagine better systems. Let's find a way to build it together. Thank you so much.